recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length and limitation of the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. And please remember to mute yourselves after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulation, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. See that we have a quorum present. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. Pursuant to notice, we shall hold a hearing today entitled Transatlantic Cooperation in Critical Supply Chain Security. I want to welcome everyone to what's an important and timely hearing to address Transatlantic cooperation on modernizing critical supply chain security. Whether it's the manufacture of communication technologies in Asia or simply shipping cranberries from a bog in southeastern Massachusetts, supply chains are essential to the everyday lives of Americans and Europeans. The US and the European Union together account for 42% of global GDP, and both rely heavily on global value chains for their trade. Thus, it's vital that we work with our transatlantic allies to modernize and secure global supply chains, which today sport 2/3 of the entire world's trade. Over the last 30 years, supply chains have diversified and now reach the entire globe. A high-end semiconductor, for example, could be designed by a tech firm in Silicon Valley, sourced from materials from around the world and manufactured in a facility in Taiwan using equipment built in the Netherlands. Further, this same semiconductor could be a component of a critical national security technology or a consumer good, such as an electric vehicle or a cell phone. In short, a supply chain encompasses everything from the design of a product to the sourcing of its materials, to its marketing, as well as its distribution to customers. As a result, supply chains are not only complex, but they are also highly specialized, requiring unique solutions for every supply chain challenge. Today, the unprecedented events of the past 2 years have put a strain on our global supply chains and forced the world to find innovative and creative solutions to alleviate shortages. The global COVID-19 pandemic has drastically changed our day-to-day lives, affecting global supply chains as a result. Increased prices and commodities have made the health of our supply chains a front-page news story for many Americans. However, to meet the challenge, I believe we must consider more than just the obstacles that lay directly in front of us, and consider rather long-term solutions to shore up persistent bottlenecks, inefficiencies, and complications that our current supply chains face. With this approach, I believe we'll not only be able to address current challenges, but mitigate and even prevent these future issues from occurring. One aspect of this long-term approach must be confronting China's role in our globalized world. China's investment in the semiconductor industry and control over rare earth imports is a growing national security concern for the United States. This growing concern can only be effectively dealt with in a multilateral fashion with our European allies and partners. Confronting China unilaterally could cause considerable harm to our own economy. We should deepen our cooperation with Europe to diversify our supply chains. We must also stand united when China chooses to use economic coercion against our allies, like Lithuania, who've chosen to opt out of China's current economic forums with Europe. For decades, it's been undeniable that our democratic partners in Europe have brought immense benefits to U.S. consumers, businesses, and organizations. Products are cheaper, more accessible, and the same is true for countries in Europe. I firmly believe our transatlantic partners remain a critical tool to modernizing and protecting supply chains, and that a strong transatlantic partnership ensures a strong transatlantic economy. To this end, I'm pleased to see the Biden administration's work with our transatlantic partners through the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. At the inaugural TTC meeting in Pittsburgh last year, 10 working groups were established to engage with our transatlantic partners in everything from establishing standards for new technologies, cooperating on data governance, and also ensuring accessibility of digital tools for small and medium-sized enterprises. The third working group of the TTC will specifically address supply chains through an initial focus on clean energy, pharmaceuticals, the availability of semiconductors and critical materials, all of which sectors are immense in their importance given to the ongoing climate and healthcare crisis. To build on the TTC's objective, we in Congress must not lose sight of the importance of addressing our supply chain security, whether it's another pandemic, increased weather events due to climate change, or vulnerabilities in our cybersecurity. Our supply chains will continue to be tested. Disruptions in our supply chains affect all Americans, and we need to work now to prepare, harden, and to secure supply chains to alleviate and lessen the impact of future potentially economically disruptive global events. As I've stated before, as chair of the subcommittee, I stand in full support of transatlantic solutions to our global problems. This includes the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, and I look forward to following up with other outcomes as we move forward with the second session, which will take place later this year. To discuss transatlantic solutions to our current problems and how we in Congress can work our transatlantic allies in these issues, we have invited three outstanding witnesses to provide testimony. Dr. Willy Shih from the Harvard Business School, Dr. Chad Bown from Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Dr. Derek Scissors from the Economic Enterprise Institute. Each will provide testimony on our supply chain security. And I look forward to a very productive discussion to see how effectively and impactfully we can move forward with transatlantic solutions to the current problems with the global supply chains. Now I'll recognize our ranking member, Representative Fitzpatrick, for his opening remark.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Keating. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. And it is my hope today that we can examine ways to strengthen our transatlantic partnerships and to fend off threats to our global economy. And in an increasingly interconnected world, global value chains have become the norm. And these multi-tiered supply chains benefit the United States and its partners greatly, but also present unique challenges. As the world was overcome by the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chains were pushed beyond their limit. As a result, the best and the worst aspects of these relationships were all exposed. There were many victories, for sure. Accelerated vaccine development and manufacturing at levels not seen before were made possible through public and private cooperation with our transatlantic allies. Only through advanced agreements, information sharing, and cooperation was this possible. There were also many flaws revealed. Domestic policies differed from nation to nation, often based on the severity of the pandemic, which brought lockdowns and dramatically reduced workforces. And these effects compounded at each point of exchange, and bottlenecks were magnified. These flaws are not lost on the strategic competitors of the United States and its transatlantic allies, especially those nations that are deeply intertwined with us economically. Recognizing that these shortcomings could be exploited, our perspective of supply chains must be increasingly viewed through the lens of national security, not just economics. We have seen firsthand that China is willing to undermine Western values through forced labor in Xinjiang and predatory lending practices in the Balkans and beyond. Less than a decade ago, the Chinese Communist Party demonstrated its monopoly on rare earth minerals and caused dramatic price fluctuations that harmed American consumers. Recently, the CCP was quick to leverage its competitive advantage as a retaliatory mechanism against Lithuania. No industry better represents the complex nature of global supply chains and their nexus with national security like that of semiconductors. Chips are truly the building blocks of modern society, yet they take months to produce and travel around the world before being installed in their end products. While our demand grows for their use in technology, from smartphones to our satellites. U.S. production of semiconductors has plummeted from 40% of the world's supply in 1990 to just 12% of the global supply today. Concurrently, China is investing in the industry at unprecedented levels, utilizing methods which appear to challenge current global rules. I have proudly worked with my colleagues to identify solutions to this issue, and members of this committee introduced through the Chips for America Act, which will go on to be included in the NDAA. The funding authorized by this bill would help build and modernize semiconductor manufacturing facilities across America to alleviate the current chip shortage that is impacting a range of industries and millions of our American workers. These types of programs will continue to bolster American manufacturing of chips and bring the knowledge and skills of our closest allies onto our own shores. Just last year, US-based Intel, North American-based Global Foundries, South Korean-based Samsung, and Taiwan's world-leading TSMC have announced that they will build domestic fabrication facilities right here in our United States. The reality is that the United States and a small group of democratic countries right now control the vast majority of semiconductor intellectual property and technology. If all of these countries work together, we can ensure that the means of production for semiconductors stays in democratic countries and are not controlled or migrated to the Chinese Communist Party. Finally, to promote cooperation and competitiveness, the United States and the EU have joined into a new trade and technology council, which in part works to develop more secure supply chains. And I am hopeful that if the TTC is used effectively, it can provide a needed venue through which to address the points of friction in the transatlantic relationship that have impeded building a united coalition against the Chinese Communist Party. Nothing is more important. However, unless Europe is willing to cease targeting US technology companies and to be more clear-eyed about the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party's unfair and illegal economic practices, this council could end up being nothing more than a talking shop that achieves little. None of us want to see that. It is my hope that our witnesses can address what more can be done to transform the strong rhetoric on the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party into necessary and united action. The time is now to build a unified coalition and to resolve key vulnerabilities in our global supply chains. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. I'll now recognize each witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, all of your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Our first witness is Dr. Willy Shih. He's a professor of management, practice, and business administration at the Harvard Business School. Prior to the Harvard Business School, Dr. Shih spent 28 years in industry at companies such as IBM and Eastman Kodak, where he worked in product development and manufacturing in a wide variety of sectors. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Shih. You'll now be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. I'll be using a visual aid during my oral testimony today. I ask that it be submitted into the record alongside my written testimony.
Without objection, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Chairman Keating, ranking member of Fitzpatrick, members of the committee, distinguished guests, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Chairman Keating said, I am on the faculty at Harvard Business School, where I've taught for the past 15 years. Prior to that, I spent 28 years in industry and doing manufacturing and product development during a time when we really saw global supply chains take root. So when I teach about this at the school, I come from the perspective of not only having studied the theory, but lived the practice. What I hope to convey today is some of the basic logic around why supply chains are structured the way they are, how the US is deeply interconnected at so many levels to Europe, and why I believe a more nuanced understanding of that can help us build a more robust partnership. Now, the key concept is tiering, okay? And by this, I mean when you have a product assembler who will rely on a network of suppliers who will in turn rely on a network of suppliers and so on down the chain. This tiering can be quite extensive, it can be quite deep. In the auto industry, is as much as 9 tiers deep. This is one of the reasons, for example, when you have a disruption somewhere in the chain, somebody can't assemble their product anymore. And we've seen a lot of this over the last 2 years. Now, why do we have this tiering? The key concept here is specialization and technological complexity. Let's say you're making a notebook computer. It takes very different skills to make the microprocessor compared to the disk storage or the solid state storage or the keyboards or mechanicals or even the battery or charger or the flat panel display. If you visit some of the factories where they make the chips or the flat panels or all these things, you see immediately how different this is. Now, we've both Chair Keating and Ranking Member Fitzpatrick have mentioned the semiconductor supply chain. If you look at the semiconductor supply chain, we've already heard about the Dutch company ASML, who makes these extreme UV scanners that cost over $150 million each. They use an optical engine that comes from Zeiss and Oberkoch in Germany. Okay, they also use an extreme UV light source that comes from Cymer in San Diego. Okay, and then what they do is they'll assemble these machines, ship them to the TSMCs of the world. Okay, who will manufacture chips produced by the Apples or the Qualcomms of the world, who will use design software that came from Synopsys or Cadence or what have you. They'll produce the completed wafer. Then they'll ship it to Southeast Asia, where you have outsourced assembly and test companies who will assemble them into packages and then ship the chips into China for final assembly. So what you see is a very complex, highly interdependent global coordination. Now, the other reason you have supply chain structure the way you do is the ability to achieve scale benefits. You see this particularly in chemicals. I did a study on active pharmaceutical ingredients and tried to map that supply chain last year. This is a corner of that map applying to steroid pharmaceuticals. It's normally very opaque. I'm not going to bore you with the details in this. It's in my written testimony, but what you see is the core is many European manufacturers occupy key supply chain positions. One last example, this was a metal tool that a manufacturer, Long Stanton, gave me a couple years ago. They're in Westchester Township, Ohio, and they manufacture the brake brackets for the carbon disc brakes in the Boeing 787 and many other commercial airlines. They buy their steel from Voest-Alpine, and then they manufacture it, then they ship the brackets to Safran Landing Systems, who assembles them in France and in the US, and then they'll ship it to North Charleston, South Carolina, where Boeing will put it into the jetliner. Okay, now what you see is a lot of this interdependence. Now, here the message is our trade policies. When we imposed tariffs on steel a couple of years ago, turns out Voest-Alpine is the only supplier that's qualified by Airbus and Boeing to make this high temperature, very unique alloy, right? We caused this existential crisis for Long Stanton that Safran said, I got to get rid of my US suppliers. Okay, so we have to think about our trade policies when we do things like that. Okay, now, having said all that, I would tell you that I see Europe and the US as highly interconnected and interdependent. While we are still a technology leader, global R&D spending and technology are much more distributed than they were 50 or 30 years ago, when it disproportionately favored the US. So if we were to view the US and the EU and maybe a few East Asian partners together, we'd have very comprehensive coverage of all the advanced technologies I can think of. Partnership with Europe makes a lot of sense to me. One in which we work together to ensure more resilience and mutual benefit. I think cooperation with Europe is critical to American competitiveness, both now and into the future. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Dr. Chad Bown is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. Dr. Bown has previously served in the Obama administration and at the World Bank. Dr. Bown, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Keating, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, and the subcommittee for the invitation. It's a pleasure to testify in front of you again today. Today, I'm going to briefly describe early lessons from my research on transatlantic policy and cooperation impacting two critical but very different supply chains now in flux. Those are COVID-19 vaccines and semiconductors. For the record, my submitted written testimony also describes insights from my research on personal protective equipment or PPE. COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing supply chains are an incredibly important example for transatlantic cooperation. The speed of scientific advancement in the supply chains that emerged across the Atlantic, especially for Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, they were extraordinary. Pfizer's vaccine would not exist without the BioNTech invention in Germany. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine was co-developed at a Janssen lab in the Netherlands, and its Leiden plant provided drug substance for the US market through much of 2021. Moderna's mRNA vaccine in use across Europe is being bottled in France and Spain after its drug substance is manufactured at a plant in Switzerland. Policy played a sizable role at incentivizing rapid vaccine research, development, and manufacturing, but it also could have done better. Through Operation Warp Speed and the Defense Production Act, the US federal government allocated funding to scale up manufacturing at risk and over the entire vaccine manufacturing supply chain, including some critical raw materials and equipment. Despite the US subsidies, though, many key inputs have been in scarce supply in the United States, Europe, and globally. DPA gave US policymakers some visibility into those supply chains to help ration inputs to plants manufacturing priority vaccines in the United States. But they lacked visibility into the supply chains in Europe and elsewhere. This created needless policy conflict, including initial accusations that were subsequently refuted with data that the United States had imposed an export embargo on vaccine inputs. Additional transparency, information sharing, and cooperation with key partners was needed to secure those supply chains and better ration inputs in short supply. The US and EU began cooperating informally in March of 2021 to resolve vaccine supply chain bottlenecks, though their joint task force was only formalized in September. Lessons from that initiative should be shared with other transatlantic supply chain resilience initiatives. Semiconductors, my second area, are the ubiquitous chips used as inputs in most everything. Semiconductor supply chains have been under scrutiny lately because demand has spiked. With too few chips, the automotive sector, as well as others, have been forced to cut production of their goods. Semiconductor supply chains, though, were under stress well before the pandemic. Beginning in 2018, the US administration imposed 25% tariffs under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Imports from China fell by billions of chips per year. The administration then imposed unilateral and extraterritorial export controls on semiconductors, as well as semiconductor manufacturing equipment to certain Chinese firms for national security and related reasons. This triggered hoarding and other market disruptions, and these policies mostly remain unchanged today. Congress has been considering legislation, for example, the CHIPS Act and FABS Act, that could result in tens of billions of dollars of subsidies to the industry. Europe is considering a potential European CHIPS Act. In the US legislation, some subsidies may be one-off incentives to locate or expand production facilities in the United States, potentially offered on a non-discriminatory basis to both American and foreign headquartered firms. Some could be investment tax credits to fund R&D. But some subsidies may be tied to production of legacy or these older node chips that are critical for sectors like autos. However, such funding may be needed in perpetuity if those semiconductors cannot be manufactured profitably in the United States or in another trusted supplier country. Nevertheless, recent reports suggest car makers and semiconductor manufacturers may be undertaking long-term contracting arrangements and partnerships to fix that particular problem on their own without subsidies. To reduce the chance of policy failure, the US and Europe should cooperate on a semiconductor supply chain resilience policy, including through the new Trade and Technology Council, or the TTC. That means coordinating on export controls, so the United States is not imposing them unilaterally, as well as on any subsidies to highlight R&D and to ensure diversification across nodes, suppliers, and locations, and to reduce the chance of a subsidy war. However, I also worry about the US and Europe suddenly giving up the fight against other countries' semiconductor subsidies, as we used to do through multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization. Both are naive to think that places like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and of course China would not respond with additional government support. A result could be global overcapacity, allegations of dumping, tariffs, and market segmentation. Finally, the experiences of semiconductors and COVID-19 vaccines argue strongly against purely domestic supply chains and autarky. For semiconductors, the February 2021 winter storm in Texas knocked American plants run by NXP and Infineon, two major chip providers to the auto industry, offline. For COVID-19 vaccines, when the FDA shut down the Emergent Biosolutions facility in Maryland for 4 months in 2021 for quality control problems, Transatlantic trade meant that Americans got access to drug substance for the J&J vaccine from a Dutch plant. Trade in these sectors has been critical throughout the pandemic. Supply chain resilience thus means additional transparency, inventory management, and diversified sourcing with trusted partners, as well as a commitment to quickly engage and cooperate on policy when an emergency strikes, especially to expand production. Transatlantic supply chain resilience policy is still a work in progress, but cooperation with the EU, especially through the TTC, should be encouraged to ensure we do it even better in future. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Derek Scissors is a senior fellow and economist with the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Scissors currently serves on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Scissors. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I should say at the outset that I am not claiming to be a Europe expert. I will claim to be a China expert, and I will try to show why a China expert should be speaking today. My main observations start with how to deal with China. China is often competitive on its own. When it is not competitive, it will often subsidize its way as it desires into any supply chain where it has set a national priority. No genuinely commercial business can compete with the extent of possible Chinese subsidies. We can't match them here. The Chinese are better at subsidies than we are, thankfully. But a downside is they can drive us out, our firms, European firms, out of critical supply chains if they so choose. If Congress does not want China to participate in a critical supply chain, the Chinese firms have to be cut out by law, both their production in China and overseas production by their firms. Measures short of that, such as tax breaks, will not work when China sets a national priority. They were subsidized right through our incentives. Now, the fact is this will be costly for us, and it will be even harder for countries that don't see China as a major threat. We shouldn't further raise the cost for everyone by also cutting our friends out from supply chains, not our treaty allies and not our FTA partners. This group certainly features, but is not limited to the United Kingdom and much of the EU. Xi Jinping would be very pleased if the West got into a fight over supply chains. We should work for the opposite outcome. The last general observation, supply chain problems are not just COVID. For example, in 2018, Congress was correctly concerned about the dominance of Chinese chemicals used in active pharmaceutical ingredients. COVID did show that even friendly countries will compete over supply in a crisis. And this is important in terms of how much US supply is needed and even being prepared enough to help our friends when they need it. But even if COVID were to end this year in terms of its impact on supply chains, we'd be back to China's potentially dangerous role in critical chains, as recognized by the committee. A few remarks on Europe. As noted already today very well, Europe is the most important of our partners due to its size and its technological competitiveness. Unfortunately, the reality is much of Europe does not see China as a serious security threat. If we treat Europe as a partner when we consider limiting China's role or eliminating it in critical chains, they will benefit from relocation of that activity to some extent and will cooperate more. If we do not treat Europe as a partner, they may refuse to join us in our actions to change supply chains. They may set up their own protected chains, as I believe Chad just suggested. The example everyone's using is chips. I will use it too briefly. We know from just today's discussion of Dutch firm ASML that we must include equipment makers as part of supply chains, even if they don't make any components in the product. If they provide the equipment, they have to be considered as part of the chains. Elkem, which is a Norwegian company, provides silicon in the chip making process. ARM of the UK can be an advanced manufacturer and has already faced a rogue China subsidiary in part because the Chinese government will accept or even encourage economic actions, whether they're illegal or legal, to bring in chip technology. These firms need to be allowed to participate in US chains. If not, it's going to hurt any effort of ours because we will reduce European cooperation. It is reassuring to see this issue in the Trade and Technology Council, which, as Representative Fitzpatrick has noted, has risk of joining a large pile of empty talk shops going back years. We can't afford that. We need the TTC to work, and it's good to see them considering semiconductors. Another example is solar. Europe has high concerns, interest in alternative energy. They do not want to depend on the Chinese in the climate change fight, and cooperation here between the US and China, US and Europe should be possible, although it will not be easy. I want to close with a set of US policy specifics because we're not going to convince Europe or anyone else to take difficult action if we're not willing to do so. So a problem here is if American firms are selling China valuable technology and American financials are investing in Chinese firms, that can undermine US credibility on the supply chain issue. It certainly makes it harder to establish independent supply chains because it makes China more competitive. Export controls are an example. There was a bipartisan vote, overwhelming bipartisan vote for export control reform in 2018, but the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce has not taken a single action to control foundational technology, which was mandated in the export control reform. I will give you an example of foundational technology. Most medical equipment would be considered foundational technology. Right now, we don't have to worry about harmonizing our export controls with Europe because we haven't taken any steps on foundational controls, foundational technology that need to be harmonized. That is not a good outcome. Perhaps an even bigger problem. From 2016 to 2020, new American investment in Chinese stocks and bonds, which supports Chinese companies, stood at $780 billion. It tripled over the previous level at the end of 2015. It's also about the same size as the current US defense budget. It's a lot of money, American money, that's supporting Chinese firms. And I can't tell you in what sectors it's supporting them because we don't have that information in public. The Department of Treasury doesn't publish it. The solution in the face of these challenges is not sweeping broad bans right away. It's that Congress decides where our priorities lie, where we need to secure supply chains, cut the Chinese out, and certainly not help them become more competitive. I read the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, which was introduced on a bipartisan basis in the House last month, as a valuable step in this direction. This is not to say the bill is ideal, but I think everybody here understands that we are overdue for action on supply chains. And the first step is for Congress to set priorities starting in this year. These priorities certainly could include semiconductors. They could include COVID-related medical supplies. They could include active pharmaceutical ingredients. We need to take actions quickly to move these chains toward independence of Chinese supply because that will not be easy or fast. So we need to start the process now. A last example, China has not been able to sustain movements in markets for rare earth elements, but it is still trying. Recently, there was a major merger of the rare earth subsidiaries of very large Chinese state-owned enterprises. There is a bipartisan Senate bill on not using Chinese rare earths in defense. I think it was introduced last week. That is certainly the right idea. China should not be in any defense supply chains. While these steps are being taken by the Congress, if the executive branch is willing, they should be brought on the TTC as priorities. Obviously, Europe will have a response, but as I mentioned at the outset, we should not be cutting Europe out of these chains. So I hope that response is cooperative. In my view, this is proper congressional guidance on trade. It could be viewed, and I hate to bring this word up because it's controversial, but it could be viewed as a narrow form of trade promotion authority, where Congress tells the president, we want you to consider these trade issues in the TTC. The Trump and Biden administrations have only talked about supply chains over the last 2 years, which I find very unfortunate. We need strong congressional action of some sort urgently. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Scissors, and thank all of you for your testimony. I think it gave us just a bit of an understanding how complex this issue is, and hopefully we'll be able to, during our questioning period, draw out some more specifics. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute yourself through your microphone and address the chair verbally. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I give this question to Dr. Bown first, but the others can come in. You touched on the idea that an example was the prior administration, Trump administration. They went ahead with tariffs. And at the time, I heard from the smallest companies in my district to some of the industrial leaders in our country. In fact, without an identification, one of our major automobile manufacturers set to set up great investment in the U.S., moved away from that and instead went to China. because of the uncertainty around some of the trade issues. To go ahead and deal with tariffs without doing the proper oversight before decisions are made to see what the impacts can be on our own business here in the U.S. I saw that happen in real time. What can we do as members of Congress for administration so that when these decisions are being made, there's more oversight and more of a recognition and the opportunity from those businesses affected, from the small businesses at the local level to our major global corporations, and to make sure they have input before final decisions are made, so we don't repeat this mistake. Start with Dr. Bown.
So I think that is a wonderful question and an accurate depiction of what happened. I would say maybe two things. So first of all, when it comes to China and semiconductors, not disagreeing at all with what others have said. China does subsidize its industry tremendously, and with the aim of achieving, not only autarky but a huge global role. That being said, still, China's not a major player at the high end of semiconductors. It's a major player in the low end, high volume chips. And as we've seen with the pandemic, when it only takes missing one semiconductor, it doesn't have to be a complicated one, but one semiconductor can, prevent a car from rolling off the assembly line, that could be a problem. And so not knowing the impact of these policies up front is critical. So I think what can Congress do? Well, it's hard. The last administration, in my view, wasn't going to take much advice from anyone. Things like allowing, it's always hard for consumers, and in this case, businesses are the consumers of a lot of these products that got tariffs put on them, have a greater voice, small businesses especially, in the process, allowing them to understand how they're going to be impacted, and that is going to mean better access to data and information, so that folks can be telling the story for them, I think is key. But aside from that, it really would be reining in some of the executive's authority to be able to undertake the sorts of trade policies that we saw unilaterally in the last administration, whether it was under Section 301, whether it was under the Section 232 national security tariffs on steel and aluminum. That's really where I think Congress can weigh in and have a more interactive oversight, constraining role on executive discretion there.
Yeah, I think that your point about the positions relatively percentage-wise. I mean, the U.S. Semiconductor industry supply chain is about 39% of the total value of the global semiconductor. And if you put in Japan, Europe, especially the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Germany, Taiwan, and South Korea, collectively, they contribute another 53%. And China, while contributing only 6%, is quickly developing capabilities. And that's what we have to be careful of. But I also, took great attention, I put great attention to what Dr. Cizik said too. In the long run, for our own economy, we just can't have a race to the bottom with China. They're authoritarian. It's a government-run business. And they can outlast us and put more supports in, sector by sector. So we don't win by that. So how do we balance this? We've seen in the pharmaceutical industry, we've seen with COVID, dealing with that pandemic, we've seen with semiconductors in particular, what happens. And we're taking actions in our defense to build our own capacity. But how do you balance that off? How do we balance off the fact that we have to remain self-sufficient as a country? Clearly, one solution is to work with our transatlantic allies and make it a bigger footprint. But also, how can we not take actions that would indeed put China in a better competitive situation, as Dr. Cizik said? Any suggestions how we can create that balance?
Well, I think it's hard in an industry like semiconductors, as Dr. Shih was describing. Some of the phases of that supply chain are extraordinarily labor intensive. And so they end up, the last step in particular of what's called offshore assembly, packaging, and testing. in many instances, it's way too labor intensive to be able to do it competitively in probably either United States or Europe. So it does involve working with non-rich countries and making sure their supply chain engagement in our secure supply chains is there as well. Now, you might ask, who should those countries be? You know, it might be Mexico as part of USMCA. It might be other parties and other countries in East Asia through something like, if we ever wanted to think about TPP or the CPTPP agreement as well. So it's not just in these complicated supply chains where there's lots of fragmentation. It's not just us in Europe. It really is looking around and figuring out who we need to collaborate with in all parts of the supply chain to make sure it's more secure and ultimately cost competitive as well.
Great. I hope we get questions later on the distribution aspects too, which is such a bottleneck right now. I'll now recognize Ranking Member Fitzpatrick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. I pose this question mainly for Dr. Scissors, but when his time has expired, if the rest of the panelists want to weigh in, I'd appreciate that. So the United States and the EU represented roughly 21% of the world's semiconductor manufacturing capacity in 2020. But that doesn't consider inputs into the semiconductor supply chain, such as rare earth minerals. Can you try to unpack the supply chain and give us more context, particularly about the inputs to the semiconductor fab process that are predominantly controlled by the Communist Chinese Party, rare earth extraction and processing, for example? And moreover, what actions should the EU, Britain, and the United States take to ensure that this supply chain does not slip under the complete control of the CCP?
Thank you, sir. I will try to be quick so others can join in. You know, I would say at this point, you start at the materials end. The Chinese are involved in the supply chain for semiconductors outside of China, primarily, in my view, at one end and the other, the materials end and the packaging end. So the question is, you know, do we need materials from China to start the semiconductor production process in a sense? I don't think the answer is yes as of yet. We have to watch Chinese behavior in rare earths and other materials markets. China, as you may know, sir, is investing heavily in lithium and cobalt overseas. So they are going to look to have a dominant position in materials markets. But as far as I know, and I'm glad to be corrected by my colleagues, that is not a concern at present. On the other side, Chinese packaging is almost impossible to compete with, partly due to subsidies, partly due to China's own competitiveness. This is a concern I have with new American plants where the supply could be interrupted even though the chips have been produced because they're all sent to China for packaging. And if you say, well, you know, we'll try to create a packaging alternative, the Chinese will just subsidize right over it. They may not have the cobalt on site, but they can subsidize over a packaging competitor very easily, which is why I said, you know, the tool here has to be not broad bans, but when the Congress thinks this is really critical to the United States, you simply can't allow Chinese participation at all. Back to the equipment manufacturers, everybody in the supply chain, because if you do, where they have an advantage now, they will subsidize their way in, and where they don't have an advantage, but they're looking for one, such as in materials, they will also subsidize their way in. One more comment to reinforce what I was saying earlier. We're shooting ourselves in the foot if we sell China advanced technology for short-term gain, and then we have to face a tougher Chinese competitor down the line and set up a supply chain separate from them. And we're shooting ourselves in the foot, actually, even a little bit more if we give the Chinese the money to develop more advanced technology in China. So this is a situation where I absolutely think we should be working with Europe. I think Europe has very similar incentives to us, at least up to a point, on semiconductors. But we need to look in the mirror and think about like what we're doing to help China become more competitive in an area where we explicitly don't want them to become more competitive. I'll stop there.
Could I weigh in here? I think one of the things we should be doing is we should be investing in new process technologies. Every time there is a transition point, and we are coming up on a transition point in the semiconductor industry because, as we know, Moore's law has been hitting the ceiling, and as people go to 3 or 4 nanometer, it's questionable how what's going to happen next. Okay, but the clear frontier is in advanced packaging. Okay, and a lot of that OSAT work not only happens in China, but the big players are actually Malaysia and Vietnam as well. Okay, and we've seen a lot of COVID outbreaks there, which has shut that down. Okay, but that's the more labor-intensive stuff. Historically, that packaging was there because it was more labor-intensive, but as we go to new technologies that are more prone to like automation, using like Intel's Foveros tile technology and things like that, that's an opportunity where we can do a transition. Similarly, for example, on chemicals, 75% of all fine chemicals are manufactured in China. That was my point earlier about scale efficiencies and how they do that. The way you unseat that is you invest in continuous flow manufacturing and make all that established capacity obsolete. Okay, if you look back in history in other industries, every time there's been that type of technology transition, that's how you grab the lead. I actually have hope on rare earths in the same way, because one of the problems with rare earths is, it's very polluting in terms of the processing. Okay, rare earths themselves are not that rare. It's just the concentrations are not economic. And where the concentrations are higher in some parts of China, and they've done a lot of processing stuff. But there's a lot of research work in how can I do maybe using biological processing methods for extracting rare earths or other things. If we go back to technology leadership, okay, and really focus it on new processing technology, continuous flow manufacturing technology, and some of these other things, then we can take advantage of these transitions that are coming and, kind of grab the lead back.
Thank you to both of you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Vice Chair of the committee, Representative Spanberger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am a strong believer that the United States must ensure that we have the domestic production capacity to ramp up production of necessary medical countermeasures in the event of shortages or emergencies. And so, Dr. Shih, I was very pleased to hear you talk about APIs in your opening statement and in your written testimony. Unfortunately, 87% of facilities that produce the active pharmaceutical ingredients for essential generic medicines are overseas. And as a result, our healthcare system suffers routine shortages of these medicines, even outside of emergencies. For example, the United States has lost the capacity to produce penicillin here domestically, and our reliance on foreign suppliers jeopardizes our ability to respond to future biosecurity threats, and it causes routine shortages that put patients' care at risk. That's why I introduced the PREPARE Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation to identify the essential generic medicines that are necessary to have available at all times. And then it authorizes the creation of a stockpile of active pharmaceutical ingredients to ensure that pharmaceutical supply chains can always produce the medicines, the essential medicines that Americans need in the event of an emergency. So, Professor Shih, I appreciate your research on the economics of active pharmaceutical ingredient production. Could you discuss the economic barriers to domestic production of APIs and give your thoughts on how Congress may be able to overcome them?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question. I think there's several aspects of it. One is the distribution channel where a lot of the purchasing happens. Okay, it's all done through group purchasing organizations. And, I've talked to a number of API manufacturers. They don't make a lot of money on the generics because a lot of the GPOs, that's where they can earn more returns, right? So they're very motivated by price, and they'll go to offshore suppliers, primarily India, and a lot of those APIs will come out of China because of price. Okay, but your point on purchasing for the stockpile, especially if there's domestic manufacturer, I think would do a long way to foster domestic production, with one caveat. I also did a study on PPE during the crisis, and one of the things that we found is a lot of small American manufacturers rose to the call from government officials, from business leaders, and everybody to manufacture PPE. By the time they ramped up, the Chinese had flooded the market with PPE masks, for example, or hospital gowns sold below the cost of the materials that those American manufacturers could produce it. Okay, so what we ended up doing is all these American businesses that rose to the call to respond ended up becoming positioned as swing producers. Okay, now if you're operating in the U.S., you are a higher cost producer, right? But if you're a higher cost producer, you cannot be a swing producer. My view of the answer to that is we have to give them stable production. Okay, and buying for the stockpile is one way to do that. You say, I'm going to give you a long-term contract. I want you to produce for the stockpile. I'll give you stable production. Use the overseas guys as a swing producer. Don't use American companies as a swing producer. Okay, so I think that would help a lot. And then, as I said earlier on API production, is like we need to think differently about process innovation. And the research is going on in the US, and there's some small startups that I've visited who are doing this API production with continuous flow. But we need to help these guys to be successful. And
So,
give them
Professor Shih, you actually got to my second question, which was related to continuous manufacturing research, because kind of what I'm hearing from your answer and from your comments is that this is an element of the challenge that encouraging the adoption of advanced manufacturing techniques is part of how we kind of pivot into this next phase, or ensure that we have the domestic production and create the need for the domestic production. How could improved advanced manufacturing techniques like continuous manufacturing overcome some of the disincentives? And I think we may be short on time, but
okay, I'll give you a very quick answer. First of all, it reduces the scale economies, okay, because the continuous flow manufacturing is very small. It's also very susceptible to parameter tuning with things like machine learning in terms of I'm going to reduce my waste products, improve my yields and stuff like that. I visited one of the startups in the Boston area that's doing this. A lot of this work came out of MIT. It's just remarkable. That's how we have to think about, you know, we're not going to play the same game against somebody who's subsidized. What we have to do is we have to change the game.
So, Professor Shih, we've got some interesting innovation happening in Central Virginia, so I hope you might travel and visit us in the future. And
I'd love to. You got VPI there.
And then thank you so much for your time to all of our witnesses. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Chair now recognizes Representative Wagner for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Chairman Keating, and thank our witnesses for joining us today. The supply chain crisis has been a total disaster for families and for small businesses. So very many of my constituents in the 2nd Congressional District of Missouri are experiencing empty shelves and skyrocketing prices due to unacceptably long shipping delays. As of Friday, January 14th, there were still more than 100 ships waiting to be unloaded at the Port of Los Angeles. Supply chain disruptions are directly tied to this Biden administration and its failed policies. We have all called repeatedly to demand that the administration take immediate action to resolve these unprecedented supply chain disruptions. This is an issue that affects the daily life of every American, but it also is a matter of national security. China is aggressively working to become a global power in this, as we've talked about, semiconductor industry, and it already dominates the supply of rare earth minerals and active pharmaceutical ingredients. The United States has an opportunity to work with like-minded partners, as Dr. Scissors has said, in Europe and elsewhere, to deny our adversaries the power to wreak havoc on our supply chains. Dr. Scissors, Taiwan is one of the world's leading manufacturers of semiconductors. To what degree is China's drive to control the semiconductor industry motivated by a desire to isolate Taiwan? And how can the United States and its allies best protect Taiwan from China's economic bullying?
Oh, that is a tough question. Because there are multiple angles to look at this. I think all of us simultaneously who follow this issue simultaneously feel a desire to be good partners to the Taiwanese semiconductor industry because it's so important to the Taiwanese economy, and we want to encourage the democracy on Taiwan. which is under threat by a cult of personality dictatorship. But at the same time, TSMC has a lot of sales in China. It is, it can be coerced to some extent by the Chinese government. And I would not be comfortable, for example, if somebody said earlier there are a list of new plants that are planned for the United States, might have been Representative Keating or Representative Fitzpatrick, but I would not be comfortable if the only plant was a giant TSMC plant. So we have to balance two things, which is we have to help Taiwan, include them absolutely as one of our partners in high value supply chains, but also not be too dependent on Taiwanese supply. Because whether we like it or not, Taiwan is very tightly integrated economically with China, and that's not going to end anytime soon. I'm not sure I got to your question, so sorry about that.
Well, let me ask you, now, Dr. Soothers, can you provide an overview of the PRC's policies designed to maintain dominance of the rare earth industry? What are the ultimate aims of China's new export control law, and how can the United States proactively mitigate its impacts?
So the Chinese have learned from their own dependence on oil, some foreign agricultural products, iron ore, that when they have the opportunity to control the raw material, they want to. And so, they have set up sort of a rare earth OPEC within China. It used to be there are a lot of independent distributors and manufacturers, and now they are all controlled by centrally controlled state-owned enterprises. So the Chinese have centralized the rare earth production process. And what they're trying to do is to be able to not necessarily even ban exports, but to threaten to ban exports, to make clear to everyone that if you want a reliable supply of rare earths, you need to base your facility in China, whatever you're making. And as you know very well, ma'am, that extends to a large range of products.
Yep.
So they're not necessarily looking to try to force people to respond to a supply cutoff, because then people start looking for recycling in their own production. What they want to do is to tell firms, the best place to get your rare earths for sure, cooperate with us. That's the message.
And I think that is the ultimate aim of their new export control law. Switching topics here in my brief time, Europe is suffering a serious energy shortages due in large part to Russia's efforts to constrict supply and destabilize markets as it foments a crisis here in Ukraine. Europe's dependence on Russia for energy may cause much human suffering this winter and could become a serious vulnerability for NATO members. It is clear that Nord Stream 2, a Russian, as we know, influence project that the Biden administration allowed to move forward by removing sanctions, will only exacerbate Europe's dependence on Russian energy. There's probably not time, but Dr. Shih, I would love to get your perspective on what role can the United States play in securing Europe's energy supply?
Yeah, Dr. Shih, briefly, since time has expired, if you could answer that.
Okay, well, we are a large producer of natural gas as well. I think, the other thing is we should be talking with them very carefully about, and this is a factor, something that's just come to the fore, is like this decarbonization and this energy transition is going to cause dislocations in many sectors. And I think that's an absence of planning.
I thank you. And
thank you.
I appreciate the chair's indulgence, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Representative Susan Wild for 5 minutes. Representative Wild, are you there? We'll go on to see Representative Deutsch. I know some people are in and out. Recognized for 5 minutes. Same with Cicilline, 5 minutes. I know some are coming back. Representative Rennett. I know Representative Titus is there. I can see you. You're recognized for 5 minutes. I think we're frozen here now. Are we back in?
I can hear you, Chairman Keating,
All right.
Brian Mast. I can hear you fine.
Chair recognizes Representative Titus for 5 minutes. Representative Titus, you can't hear me either. We're having a little technological difficulty. I can see Representative Titus. Are All right, I'm going to go to Representative Schneider for 5 minutes. I see you just sitting down, Representative. So Ben, are we having some difficulty? I know Representative
No.
Mass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I just stepped away.
Okay, you're recognized for 5 minutes. And while we're doing that, staff can touch base with Representative Titus, perhaps, her staff, and see what's going on there.
Right,
I recognize Representative Schneider for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for calling this hearing and our witnesses for sharing their perspectives today. And Professor Shih, I may start with you. Reading your bio, I come from a similar vintage. I was an industrial engineer, graduated in 1983. And in preparing for the hearing, I was struck. I was doing some research. I came across a New York Times article by David Sanger, I think might still be there, talking about critical shortage in semiconductors, noting that it was easing after a year of scarcity forced by many makers of computers, video cassette recorders, and other electronic products to reduce their production. That was 1984, and it was talking about EEPROMs and 64K memory chips, a very different time. And in your remarks and answers, you've talked about many of the advances made, but also an emphasis of shifting technologies. And I know we've made so much advance, especially under Moore's law, with the doubling of capacities, getting to extremely tight tolerances, but we need to look at other areas. And so I was hoping you might expand a little bit more about the continuous process manufacturing, how that differs from batch manufacturing, and how it is potentially a pathway for us to both address supply chain, but also the dependencies on foreign countries and improve our strategic position, as well as what might be some of the barriers to achieving it in the long term.
Okay, so let me talk about continuous manufacturing in chemicals. Okay,
Right.
75% plus fine chemicals come from China. Okay, it was a sector that they identified as very important. All right, so there was a lot of subsidies into small companies who would make these fine chemicals. Okay, and as we know, fine chemicals go into a lot more than just active pharmaceutical ingredients. They go into many, many different things. When you think about a typical batch reactor, that may be 50 liters, it may be 500 liters, sometimes it may be larger than that. Okay, and usually it's like a stainless steel or a titanium vessel, and you mix chemicals in there, okay, and you make things a batch at a time. Okay, and hey, I'll have a tank truckload of methylene chloride that I'll use for, and I'll go and do all these things batch-wise. Okay, now there's a cost to doing things in those scales, right? Because you have to also process the waste, and you have to purify them and stuff like that. The continuous flow manufacturing, and there's a company that I visited in Boston, I mentioned it, Snapdragon Chemistry, came out of MIT. And this was work originally funded by DARPA. And the idea was, loosely, I want to take earth, fire, water, and air in one end, and I want to be able to make battlefield medicines, right? It was the DARPA Battlefield Medicine Initiative. But the idea was, could I put inside, like a shipping container, a factory that could make chemicals on demand? Okay, now, in the continuous flow model, what I'm doing is I'm talking about very small reactors that are, because they don't have a lot of chemical, they don't enclose a lot of volume, and usually I'm flowing them. Then I can do a lot of things that I can't do in a batch reactor. Okay, I can handle explosive reactions because I have very small volume, or I don't have to worry about mixing, or I can put sensors and all this stuff on monitoring the inputs and outputs and improve my yields. Okay, so it's a new way. It's, a lot of companies are interested in adopting it, but what it does is it obsoletes all that existing infrastructure that people already have, and it becomes much more scale efficient. It's much more kind of IT intensive, things that play to American strengths. So I've been advocating we should think that way, on some of these kind of technology transitions. Same with chip packaging, right, which I think is a technology transition. We can be smart about it, and it's like, let's grab the lead doing stuff that the U.S. has always been good at. which is leading edge science, leading edge thinking, if you will. Okay, taking those risks. I mean, we saw what Operation Warp Speed did with mRNA vaccines in terms of accelerating something that had never been an approved drug before. Okay, and so the way I think about it is like in semiconductors, advanced packaging, right? In pharma APIs, you know, continuous flow manufacturing. Think process changes like that.
So taking that a step further, and I can open this up to everyone, you know, and you mentioned Operation Warp Speed, which did accelerate the bringing vaccines to the market. You mentioned DARPA. There are ways governments can remove barriers, remove obstacles. There's ways governments can change the slope to accelerate progress. We're not the ones who are necessarily inventing it, certainly not the people on this panel. What things can we do to help expand our capabilities, expand our capacities, open the door so that U.S. industries are leading the ways on new technologies, new capabilities?
Yeah, and recognizing time, I'll be very brief here. Okay, let's talk about Operation Warp Speed and mRNA vaccines. Everybody thinks that was a 1-year miracle or 2-year miracle. mRNA vaccines were first proposed in 1990, and it was because the U.S. invested so much in genomics, the Human Genome Program, biotechnology, you name it, life sciences broadly, over the period of 1990s to 2000s. You know, DARPA did a project with Moderna on mRNA vaccines and pandemic preparedness. I think it was 2013 or 2014. But it was that long-term investment in the basic science, you know, the leadership there. That's what this country is good at, right? And so I think if we invest in that kind of leadership R&D, foster this marketplace of competing ideas. That's what you don't see in China, by the way. You know, fostering all these competing ideas. That's what we're good at. That's how we lead.
Thank you. I know I'm out of time. I don't know if there's time for the other witnesses to weigh in, but if not, I yield back my time. And again, thank the chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Chair recognizes Representative Mast for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Cizik, Shih, Bown, appreciate your testimonies today. I just want to start with a question surrounding the LNG conversation, the gap in Europe. We could talk about what's going on in Asia as well, but just an opinion question for each of you. Do you doctors consider LNG clean or dirty energy?
I consider it clean. I don't, we could go into detail about that, but short answer, I consider it clean.
I consider it cleaner and a critical transition fuel.
Same, cleaner.
Cleaner. All right. Fair enough. I appreciate you giving me an answer. Dr. Cizik, I guess I would ask, or Shih or Bown after that. Do you think there's anything that we in the U.S. should be learning from that gap that we're filling for Europe right now as it relates to LNG? I've watched the numbers over the months, of our exports. It's gone from, 20, 30, 40, over 50%, I believe, at one point of our exports going to fill that gap for LNG over in Europe. Opinion, love to see us, taking work away from Russia. But is there something that you all think that we should be learning from that? Is there a point that we hit a wall that we can't fill that gap? And do we consider that to be sustainable for us to continue to fill that gap for them?
I'll go quickly first because I know you want to hear from all of us. I think the LNG, the gas crisis in Europe falls under the category that I was mentioning right at the beginning, which is when we think of crisis preparedness in the United States, we should not just think about what we're producing for ourselves. We should be thinking about what we're producing, if we can, for our key allies. So I've criticized the Biden administration right from the beginning, saying, look, go slow on this whole we don't like fossil fuel production thing, because the world isn't moving at the same speed we are. And it would be helpful right now if the U.S. had whatever our maximal gas production capacity was, so that we could help our friends when they're in trouble, so that we could serve our geopolitical aims to reduce Russian influence in this case. So my general point here is, I don't think we're maximized at our energy production. You don't necessarily want to maximize your energy production at all times, but you do when one of your close allies, as Europe is in jeopardy. And I would like us to think about crisis preparedness, not just for ourselves, but for our friends. And I think that would put us in a better position with regard to energy supplies to Europe or to Asia, which, as we know, East Asia is extremely dependent on the Middle East.
I guess what I would say on LNG is, it's only recently that we've been able to export LNG. And there's a difference between production and export. Export requires massive investments of these, in these terminals to be able to sell it. And so this is not something you're going to be able to ramp up on scale relatively quickly. And piggybacking on that, this was a huge priority with the Trump administration as part of the phase one agreement with China. China is supposed to be buying all of our LNG exports in order to meet the phase one commitments. So, you kind of can't have both, saying they need to reach $200 billion of American exports and say that you want to divert LNG exports to Europe to help deal with the challenges there, right? So some of this is part of the inherited mess from the Trump administration's trade policy.
Pause you, Dr. Bown. How much do you think of that is from us approving permits for those plants? Not us, but how much do you think of that is in red tape? Could that be ramped up quicker?
I mean, my understanding of this industry, I'm not a huge expert, but it requires the capital investments necessary to, for the terminals is a separate endeavor that typically requires long-term relationships between, American suppliers and foreign buyers to make it worthwhile for them to undertake the investment.
They got to know the buyers are there and they're not going to start sucking it out of a Russian pipeline right away.
No, it's not quick.
Dr. Shih, anything you care to add? We got about 40 seconds remaining.
Yeah, I would just add, one of the things I think we should have learned is we need to do more planning around the energy transition, okay? Because, we're going to see that in, the grid going from centralized generation to distributed generation and distributed consumption, right? So there are other areas. I mean, to me, it's a warning call that we need to think about the other implications of this energy transition, which we're moving down.
I appreciate the testimonies from everybody today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Go back.
Thank you, Representative. Chair recognizes Representative Costa for 5 minutes. Representative Costa, you're having people come in and out, I know, because of other issues.
Hold it there. Can you hear me now?
I can. Representative Costa, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important subcommittee hearing. And I'm multitasking, and I've got a markup in natural resources going on concurrently. But Dr. Bown, I work very closely with the chairman here with our European allies, and I chair the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. And in our parliamentary group that you may be familiar with, the US and the EU, do you see any potential for cooperation that doesn't already exist between ourselves and the European Union on critical supply chains? And what topics do you believe that we should prioritize for transatlantic cooperation to improve supply chain resiliency, particularly in reducing our dependence on China?
So some of it's already happening, and I think it's being facilitated by not only the work that you're doing, but by the TTC, right? And so I think one aspect is on export controls. This is sort of a new competency in the European Commission, and it's important to get them aligned with what we want to be doing on export controls, because we manufacture so many of the same things that if they're not willing to put controls on exports, our willingness to do so could go for naught and not end up protecting national security. So they need to be on the same page. In other areas, I think it's important to have the channels of communication open. So the example that I gave about vaccines, was hopefully unique. We never see something like that again. But the shortages that arose meant that it arose essentially because American policymakers didn't have visibility into the European supply chain. So we needed communication between essentially at that point the White House coordinator on COVID response, with the Brussels coordinator on COVID, and they eventually got there. But I think having a TTC up and running in place could help facilitate those connections earlier so that when problems do arise, we can tackle them, whether it's on, vaccines or semiconductor shortages, things like that. My sense is these connections are being made, and hopefully we'll see better integration and policy in future.
You're basically saying closer cooperation between the EU and ourselves on a host of these supply chain issues are critical to both ourselves and our allies.
Yeah, recognizing that when a challenge happens, that someone across the Atlantic may be able to help us as opposed to being our nemesis, right? I think is a sort of change in mindset, but that we can rely on each other and we need to be benefiting from diversification.
No, and I've reminded folks that our European friends are our allies, not our adversaries, as
Exactly.
the previous president noted. And thanks for giving context on warp speed, because while it was successful, clearly a lot of work had been done over the last 20 years. Dr. Shih, what should be our focus during the Trade and Technology Council session during the 2022 spring forum? And can we ensure that concrete actions and policy solutions emerge from the forum?
Well, I think, as Dr. Bown said, I think alignment on kind of some of the strategies around supply chains. I think especially around export controls, as he pointed out, if we impose controls and, other countries go to the Europeans, we end up shooting ourselves in the foot. A good example of that is what happened with GPS when we controlled that, and that spawned a European effort as well as a Chinese and a Russian and now a UK effort. I think the other thing is we need to have a pretty candid discussion with them about a lot of these issues, and we need to understand what it takes to be a reliable supplier to them too, right? I think their perception is not that we are a reliable supplier. And if you're not a reliable supplier, then they're going to look for alternatives, right? True allies will share the pain when we have a natural gas crisis, even though there may be domestic costs to that.
I think that's a good
Yeah.
point. And I've got a little
Representative
bit of time.
Costa, if I could suspend for 2 seconds. Someone is not on mute in the background. Just ask someone to check to see that you're on mute. Chair recognizes Representative Costa.
All right, I'll be quick here. I don't know which of the three of you might want to offer whether or not we can grow our rare earth industry in the United States, and how can we work with our allies to solve problems with the rare earth supply chain?
Let me offer, we have good deposits in Wyoming, okay? We don't have the processing infrastructure. Linus, the Australian firm, is building a processing plant in Texas, okay? Having stable demand for domestic suppliers is a good way to do that. And that might, in this case, it would make a lot of sense to purchase for a stockpile.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Chair recognizes Representative Muser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses very much. Dr. Scissors, would you say that in 2019, the U.S. economy on a comparative basis to the rest of the world that we traded with was doing well?
Wow, put me on the spot there, sir. I would say yes, it was, but I also see the seeds for problem because we were borrowing too much money. That's my own personal opinion on how to judge success.
Fair. Our deficit did increase that year by $520 billion. Of course, over the last couple of years, we've had COVID, but I mean, we're up 6 trillion, I believe it is. So little bit more. In 2018, our GDP was 20 trillion. Our China trade deficit was 419. In 19, our GDP was 21. Our China trade deficit was 319. In 2020, the year of COVID, we went down to 19 trillion in GDP. 310 China trade deficit. And in 21, we had an absolutely booming year, 23 trillion with 344 trade deficit. So what's interesting there is that the size of the increase, $4 trillion, nearly 20%, but also the fact that we are thinking that we're buying everything necessarily from China, and it went up relatively proportionally. Of course, you got inflation in that GDP number and a tremendous amount of government spending. So we know where we are with outcomes. You know, I was in the real world in business for 25 years, and there you focus on outcomes, not intentions. So, you know, what we have right here is we have enormous demand in certain sectors. I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know. Consumer spending is very high. We have incredible workforce shortages in rural areas and throughout cities. It exists. So all you got to do is take a walk with me down Main Street, and you'll hear every single business tell you that. Now, in China, they had their shutdowns as well, and that's primarily the reason that we got so many cargo ships offshore. But our domestic production clearly was dramatically reduced, from furniture to bacon, and that's why we have the type of inflation we haven't seen since 1982. So why would you think that this administration would think it's a good idea? Because to me, it's the worst time to increase government spending, and this is for Mr. Shih as well, and perhaps the other witness. I mean, worst time to increase taxes, worst time to put down certain mandates on employment availability, all right, without doing it in a smart way, particularly without doing any stockpiling of testing. Here you have this huge test mandate, and you discuss it anyway, it gets proven unconstitutional, and then you don't even bother worrying about the supply. So my question to you is, do you think the continued idea to continue to spend and increase taxes is the right way to go in this sort of environment?
No, I definitely don't. I understand why people have a response to a crisis that they think in the short term, what do we need to do right now? This is urgent. I get that, and we can have an argument over short-term policy. But on long-term policy, I think we're in complete agreement, sir. I would say, as somebody who thinks about U.S. economic competition versus China, you don't want to win the debt race. You don't want to be first in debt. As we have discussed repeatedly in this hearing, you do want to be first in innovation. Innovation does not solve all your problems, but if you want to win an economic competition, you want to be healthy economically, you need to innovate. And finally, as you mentioned, we need to train our workers. That's we have a lot of people. There's thoughts that people don't want to work anymore. Let's give them the skill level to get a job that they like better than the one they have or the one they don't want to apply to. So
I agree. It's hard with a $50,000 annual cost for college, $50,000 plus. And I'd love to get the witnesses' thoughts on the CHIPS Act, because I certainly believe it's imperative, important, and necessary. So maybe we could get that in a follow-up. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I understand my time's run out.
Thank you, Representative. Chair recognizes Representative Tenney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thanks for the witnesses. Really interesting discussion. I'm going to direct my first question to Mr. Scissors or Dr. Scissors. In 2020, Communist Chinese Party signed the 15-nation regional comprehensive economic partnership and included some of our close allies like Japan and South Korea, who are already parties to that. What do you think this will mean for the EU, Britain, and the US as we seek to create supply chain resiliency against the Chinese Communist Party? And that's my first question. I got a quick second one coming on that.
So I don't think RCEP itself, the substance of it, matters very much. It's not a liberalizing, dynamic agreement. I think what matters in RCEP is the question of U.S. commitment. As I mentioned earlier, and others have mentioned during the conversation, if you want to cooperate with Europe, you need to be a reliable partner in your regulatory action, in your supply. And if the U.S. the U.S. doesn't have to respond to RCEP, but if the U.S. says, look, we really can't make international agreements, it's too hard, there's too much bipartisan bickering, that really hurts our cooperation here. So I don't think RCEP puts us in a difficult way itself in supply chains. Where we put ourselves in a difficult position is we're not out there saying we want to work with our partners, we're willing to pay some price to do that, we're going to stick to policies, we have agreement. And that's, to wrap up quickly, I think the TTC and congressional guidance to the TTC is an area where we could have bipartisan cooperation. That would be really important. That'd be a really important signal, not just to Europe, but to our allies in East Asia.
Okay, so I see your recommendation of the Biden administration is not to worry too much about this at this point.
Not to worry too much about RCEP. RCEP is a diplomatic agreement, but it is to care about U.S. credibility that we will engage on economic issues and stick to our word.
So let me just say the EU has been pursuing a digital sovereignty agenda that targets U.S. firms for discriminatory treatment, which in some ways is similar to what China often does. These EU policies are antithetical to transatlantic cooperation. I realize that was a diplomatic one, on critical supply chain security and other areas. If the EU is unwilling to treat the United States as a trusted partner, especially referring to those agreements, in the case of cloud services, in this case, why should the United States treat the EU as a trusted partner when it comes to semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and others that we're dealing with them on?
Very quickly, I think you raise a really important point. We are being, we don't have all the time in the world. We're being very facile in saying, okay, the U.S. and the EU should cooperate more. But there are problems in the U.S.-EU relationship we're going to have to overcome. I guess what I'd hope the EU will do, and I certainly hope we will do, is remember that our differences with the EU pale compared to our differences to China. And so we have to be prepared to say, you're doing something we don't like, we'll put up with that one. Not this one, we'll put up with A, not with B, and they have to be prepared to do the same thing. And we may find out Europe can't do this. The EU is not a single actor, as we know. It takes them a long time to come to agreement, even when some of the partners agree with us. But I think we should try, because our problems with Europe, while they exist and they're important, they're much less than our problems with China.
Right. So in terms of technological sovereignty for these products, shouldn't we be a little less reliant on EU and maybe chart our own course, because we're going to have some preventative resiliency against China, even with EU not as much of a partner as we'd like them to be, or at least not as trusted as we think they can be. How would you react to that?
Well, I think we should try to talk to our friends, Europe, our USMCA partners, Japan, Australia, Philippines, which is a treaty ally. When they won't go along, we're going to have to be self-reliant. So we're going to have to be prepared to be self-reliant. We should try to get our friends on board, but we have to have a backup plan.
Thank you. Dr. Shih, if I don't know, I have 55 seconds left. What specific suggestions for the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, which had its first meeting in September of last year, do you have beyond just the statements we've seen? Specifically, what actions would you like to see come out of these talks upcoming? You got 40 seconds.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would like to see the discussion on kind of our strategic interest and how, as Dr. Scissors has pointed out, we actually have a lot in common. There are issues, obviously, on some of the technology companies, and I think that is the essence of a negotiation and horse trading. Okay, but I think right now, many of the companies I talk to over there are very worried about the U.S. in terms of what they view as perhaps, a somewhat cavalier approach on sanctions and so on, right? So I think it's a hard negotiation. It's going to take time.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Just briefly go through some follow-up second round issues that I know that members that were called away wanted to address. And one is what Dr. Shih has spoken about with research and the importance of that research. We know from the defense side, our government's investing in many research areas, but also with other governmental efforts, including the infrastructure bill that was passed, or the Build Back Better, which is in the Senate. How important for us competitively is it to keep investing as a country in research? Dr. Shih?
I think it is foremost. That is what we're good at. That is, as we see, those are the things that lead to down the road, whole industries. And the example I always use is, biotech and life sciences, what we did in the 80s and 90s, and we're just scratching the surface on all the good things that are going to come out of that are world beating, right? If you look at all the global pharma companies who have decided they have to be in the U.S. because of that. Okay, so and that has happened before, right? We saw it in semiconductors in the 1960s, okay, with investments primarily by NASA and the Defense Department in semiconductors, right? In the 60s, NASA and DoD consumed 60% of all that. We've seen that in aerospace, especially. I'm a huge fan of what NASA has done in terms of, technology programs, winglets, supercritical wings, high compression ratios, energy efficient engine program. It's a remarkable success, or what they've done with commercial crew, right? And so what you see is that kind of investing in the forefront, investing in, having the competition of ideas, okay, having lots of different players come up with their ideas, not all of them succeed. That's what this country is good at. Having said all that, one of the other things I tell people I think is very important is we have to work on the demand side as well, okay, because too many technologies we've seen get developed in the U.S. and they get commercialized offshore because we no longer have, the manufacturing infrastructure or the products that those go into. I've been associated with companies that end up being sold off to Asian competitors because we don't have that, right? So working on the demand side, I think, is also an important part of that.
Yeah, the other broad issue that we really haven't touched on to any great extent that really is a time frame that is out of our control and exigent, and that's the whole issue of climate change. When I was at the summit in Glasgow, the private sector came forward with a commitment to $131 trillion of investment. And as we go forward, how can we be sure the U.S. is positioned to take advantage economically of this massive investment that's going into climate change?
So let me give you a few examples there, okay? Because one of the main trends that you're seeing, of course, is electrification, not only in transportation, but also grid modernization, distributed generation, and stuff like that, okay? Knowing that that's coming, and the U.S. is still a leader in, for example, Group 3-5 semiconductors, okay? If you want to build 800-watt car chargers, fast chargers, you're going to need silicon carbide and gallium nitride Group 3-5 semiconductors, right? But understanding where these things are going and then investing in the forefront technologies, okay, and actually the opportunity for the U.S. in grid modernization with the infrastructure bill is that we'll have demand for some of those things, right? So that we can pull them through, and then we can actually make businesses that are successful producing those in the U.S. So I think it's actually an opportunity, but we really need to be well informed on some of the challenges associated with that, because and the Europeans have seen this a lot in terms of electrification and distributed generation and power storage and stuff like that. They've encountered a lot of problems. China has encountered a lot of the problems. I was reading a paper on high voltage DC and net oscillation because of using a lot of power semiconductors connecting all those wind turbines and solar farms and stuff like that. So there's a lot of opportunity, but we really need to understand those issues and recognize them as opportunities.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to touch base on that?
Can I make a 30-second comment, Mr. Chairman? I agree completely with the emphasis here on innovation. It's absolutely vital for competitiveness. I don't want to cast the slightest aspersion on it. I don't think it's sufficient. And I'll give an example on climate change. The Chinese did not come up with breakthrough solar panel technology. originally. Not to say they're not competitive in solar panel technology now, but originally they didn't. And yet they subsidized and drove everybody out of business so that they have an absolutely dominant position in solar panels. So when you are ahead of a competitor in terms of innovation, fine. You know, you don't have to worry about them barging in on your market. But in areas where the U.S. cannot stay ahead, and we will not be able to stay ahead in everything, we do have to consider that secondary point of we're going to have non-market economies or interventionist economies harm our demand. Europe had a ton of demand for solar, but it wasn't enough to keep the Chinese out, even though the Chinese at the time were not the most innovative. So innovation is the first step for sure. I just want to be cautious that we're not going to be ahead in every area, which means there are other factors we have to consider.
Dr. Bown, any comments on that?
So related to this, and it will tie in with climate, is I think going back to Operation Warp Speed and drawing the lessons from that. And while I don't disagree with the way it's been characterized, I'd like for us to take a little bit of a step back and remember that we actually subsidized 6 different vaccines at the beginning. 3 of them didn't work out. 1 of them worked out, so this is the J&J, but then we had massive production problems. All of this is to say that's incredibly natural. We need to diversify. So anytime we're thinking about industrial policy or intervening in areas, we have to think about being diversified. We have to be willing to accept some failure because that's part and parcel of how innovative sectors work. And then we need to have an exit strategy when we see that failures are happening so that we don't, pile good money after or bad money after good or whatever the expression is. So I think there's a full range of lessons that we can take from the experience of Operation Warp Speed to apply to other areas in future.
Lastly, Representative Titus, who was on for most of this hearing, has asked me to bring forth one other issue, if you could, for the record. And that's one that we're all familiar with. I mentioned it briefly in my opening remarks, hoping to get to it. But that's part of the distribution problems that we have as well. Representative Titus has a great concern on ports and the issues that hurt us in terms of transportation backlogs and jams in the distribution network of our supply chains. Would anyone want to comment on that issue?
Let me say 2 things related to the distribution and kind of equity issues here. One is to remind everybody that much of the explanation for the massive supply chain disruptions that we're seeing is a demand side phenomenon. We're not back to a normal world where people are consuming the normal amount of services that they would normally consume. They don't go to his restaurants. They don't go to spas. They don't go on vacation as much. And what that means is they've taken their budgets and they're spending it on goods. And a lot of those goods are traded. They come through the ports. They come through the transportation system. And that's why the supply chain logistics network has been overstressed. Some of that will go away with time. Some of that is pandemic related. Finally, one other one on distribution. So Professor Shih rightly characterized new technologies in the semiconductor industry as potentially allowing us to bring back this offshore assembly and test, this last stage of the semiconductor manufacturing process. But we should keep in mind that's incredibly automated new technologies. And so if we're thinking that manufacturing of semiconductors is a jobs plan, we have to keep that in mind. We're not talking about jobs here. And the jobs that are going to be there are probably really high-end jobs. So this is national security. I understand it. It's resilience. I understand it. But this could in and of itself feed into additional inequities in our system that need to be addressed elsewhere.
Yeah, I think the EU clearly has integrated that in to their decision making on these areas, as hopefully we have too. I noticed that Dr. Shih wanted to comment on that.
I was just going to reinforce what Dr. Brown said about it's really been a demand surge. If you talk to people in the logistics industry, container lines and so on, they will point to the eastbound Trans-Pacific as being the thing that has upset all of the logistics networks. There's so much demand on that trade lane. It's sucking capacity out of, for example, out of the transatlantic trade lanes and some of the other trade lanes. And the other thing to remember is that as you get congestion as you get 102 ships docked offshore, as they, if you looked, I checked Port of Long Beach yesterday, there were some ships unloading there that had left their ports in Asia in November, okay, and they're just unloading now. What that does is it removes a huge amount of capacity from the system, okay, and so now the congestion, when we have all the containers piled up, it's very hard to move stuff through the yards onto intermodal, onto trucking, especially when you're facing labor shortages. But the congestion begets more delays and more congestion. That's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and we're seeing how fragile the supply chain is too, because just the lack of a universal platform on the trucks when the containers are being, loaded, that's created jams, as well as some of the unforeseen, I think, resignations in certain areas, or people moving away where they were able to make money as a truck driver. They're being paid on the number of deliveries. Now that's cut in half. And a lot of them are getting out of the business as a result. So it's a fragile network we have. I think the fact that some of the things we import come from countries where they're still not digitizing rather the cargoes. They're still doing it in hand, and they cause delays in that respect. So there's things we'll learn from this going forward. But I think the three of you have clearly raised a lot of issues that still remain to be dealt with. I really appreciate your participation, because I think we looked at this issue from so many different perspectives, and in many respects just scratched the surface of what we're doing, and that's something that probably we anticipated. But I appreciate your input. We'll look forward to your entire testimony being part of the record, and some members may have questions in writing as we go forward. So the members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the limitations on the rules. And again, I want to thank all of you for your participation. This is an issue that will be ongoing, and one that's critical, not just to the U.S. Economy, but globally to the economies that we face. So again, thank you for your time. This hearing is adjourned.